4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
Neil Armstrong had a weird encounter while on the moon, and he kept it from everyone else for over 50 years. The Apollo 11 commander is up there among other legends at NASA when it comes to space travel because of the feat he attained when he became the first man to step onto the moon's surface on July 20th, 1969. We're all aware of this historical experience, but there's one particular event that was hidden from the public. While on the moon, Armstrong encountered something that almost stopped the Apollo 11 mission from coming home, which he kept a secret until he died. What did the first man on the moon hide from us? Was he attacked by aliens on the moon when he wanted to leave? Join us as we explore what the first man on the moon really hid for all these years. Slowly, the first moon landing has grown into the realm of American mythology. The crackly audio coming from an almost hesitant but calm Neil Armstrong is still highly preserved as he stepped from the ladder onto the moon's surface with the words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LEM footpads are only impressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. I'm going to step off the LEM now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This was such an astonishing accomplishment that the decade-long journey was channeled into a single event. It almost looks as if on a summer day in 1969, 3 men climbed into a rocket, traveled to the moon, pulled on their spacesuits, walked around and mounted the American flag before coming home. However, that was not all that happened. Neil Armstrong met something which he kept a secret but was eventually revealed when he died. Before Neil Armstrong was able to take his small step for a man on July 20th, 1969, he and the rest of the Apollo 11 crew underwent a stern process of training in order to prepare for their lunar mission. While much of their training happened at testing facilities and in the classroom, NASA also assigned the astronauts tasks like gathering geological specimens. They also did training like entering and exiting the lunar module to help build muscle memory to replicate these procedures on the moon. And in order to make the team's training as realistic as possible, the crew trained at selected sites right here on Earth that looked weirdly alike to the moon's topography. The National Aeronautic and Space Administration was searching for places that would roughly estimate the moon's geological features, says Stephen Garber, a policy analyst in the NASA History Program office. But since we hadn't been there before, it was something of a guessing game. As they trained, astronauts Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins had to go through frequent field trips in several locations nationally and internationally. Although most of their field work took place in the American Southwest, in regions in Texas, Arizona, and Nevada. The reason they trained at so many sites was to get an appreciation for the different aspects of various geological features they would come in contact with during their mission, Garber said. They also had a combination of classroom training and field training, although the field training was really highlighted a fair amount because NASA wanted to instill the steps in the astronauts' muscle memory. This field training was done so the astronauts wouldn't have to waste their time worrying about how to take a photo or how to take a sample. Using their hands and small shovels, the astronauts continuously practiced how to collect and analyze soil and rock samples at multiple sites so that the process would become ingrained in them once they arrived on the moon. Other equally important simulations the astronauts underwent included digging trenches and collecting samples at different levels, selecting site locations, and driving core tubes into the soil for sample collection. They also practiced describing geological features, both verbally and in written format, and documenting sites using photography. To top it all off, they also knew how to label the samples they collected. After seeing the advantages of training at lunar analogs, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration made analog missions a regular training tool for astronauts preparing for future space travel, including for future Apollo missions. Well, all this training seemed to go out the window when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin saw a problem 4 minutes into Apollo 11's landing sequence. It all started when the abrupt words of Apollo 11's commander Neil Armstrong came from the speaker in Mission Control saying the words, "Program alarm." Buzz Aldrin was standing beside Armstrong in the descending lunar module as he stared at the frozen display on the computer which read 1202. This was an error code, but they had no idea where the error was coming from. Controllers in Houston checked their journals as they tried to find what exactly the problem was, but time was not on their side. "Give us a reading on that program alarm," Armstrong said. He sounded tense, but no more so than usual during the simulations. It was difficult to admit that a life-or-death struggle was playing out 386,000 kilometers from Earth in a fragile small machine that was plunging rapidly to the moon. Communications were flickering, the computer was seeming like it would quit at any second, and Gene Kranz, the flight director for the first lunar landing, felt Mission Control slip a bit further behind the power curve. The issues started out immediately upon separation from the command module in which Armstrong, Aldrin, and Michael Collins had ridden to the moon. Collins stayed in the command module as Armstrong and Aldrin landed, but Mission Control was having trouble with the radio link to the lunar module. "It was purely my decision how much information was enough," Kranz recalled. "This is now going through my mind. Do I have enough information to continue? And the answer is yes, but barely. I gave the crew the go for powered descent, that is, to begin the rocket braked landing, and we immediately lost communications again." Aldrin had tried all he could, including repositioning the antenna. Mission Control had also done what they could on their end, but the radio connection just kept on fading in and out. If it got much worse, Kranz would have to order an abort on the mission. As flight controllers on Earth battled with communication issues and spotty radar data, the master alarm sounded in the lunar module cabin, also lighting console warnings in Mission Control. The landing computer was signifying an overload, which was the 1202 alarm it displayed. The alarm meant, "I have too much to do, so I'm going to stop, reboot, and start over." If this occurred, mission rules would have called for an instant abort, as their ability to navigate the landing would be endangered. The computer was getting more data than it could handle. The event surprised Aldrin because the code was unfamiliar to him. "We couldn't look it up in the book to see what the problem was because we were watching where we were going," he said. Neil Armstrong, on the other hand, was tense for a bit, but he still asked Houston for clarification. Back here on Earth, controller Steve Bales made the call. It was okay to continue, so long as the alarm was irregular. In the middle of landing, it was almost as dangerous to try to abort with a bad computer as it was to carry on with the landing, Bales said. So balancing risk versus risk, we decided that the safest thing would be to continue to land. Charlie Duke, a fellow astronaut and capsule communicator, relayed the message to space. "We're going on that alarm." But then, in a matter of minutes, the computer sent out another alarm, 1201. It was the same class of warning, so they continued. "Same type, we're going," Duke radioed. At this point, Buzz Aldrin was locked in on the instrument displays, calling off the numbers for speed, altitude, and other critical data, as Armstrong was in manual control of the landing. Still, there was another issue slowly rearing its head. They were not where they were supposed to be. Aldrin recalled in a statement, "In the commander's window was a grid, a vertical line with marks on it, and this was calibrated to Armstrong's height and his eye level. Taking cues from the computer, the commander could check against this grid to determine the LM's position over the moon. Now it told them that they were coming in at long or downrange. Between the moon's lumpy gravity and some extra speed picked up when they undocked from the command module, Armstrong and Aldrin had overshot the predicted landing zone. As a result, a bad view glared at Armstrong. Where the orbital map showed a smooth and plain area, there was instead a vast crater field and collections of truck-sized boulders. Flying manually, Armstrong leveled off and searched for a smooth spot. "I was looking at my trajectory plot," Charlie Duke said in a statement. "Neil leveled off at about 122 meters and was darting across the surface. It was far from what we had trained for and seen in the simulations, so I started getting a little nervous, and they weren't telling us what was wrong. It was just that they were flying this strange trajectory." In the space capsule, Armstrong and Aldrin were in fact flying for their lives, not just because they flew at a strange trajectory, but because they were also running low on fuel. With a rapidly diminishing fuel supply, they would soon reach the 60-second mark, 1 minute to a mandatory abort, and it was not certain whether an abort would happen or not, or if a forced staging and emergency ignition of the ascent engine would even be possible at this altitude. "You never want to go under the dead man's curve," said Controller Bales. "It was an altitude where you don't have enough time to do an abort before you had crashed. Essentially, you're a dead man," he concluded. Capsule communicator Duke called the 60-second fuel warning, but Armstrong stayed focused on a smooth spot ahead, while Aldrin continued calling out the speed and range.
60 seconds.
We heard the call of 60 seconds and a low-level light came on. That, I'm sure, caused concern in the control center, Aldrin recalled with a smile. They probably normally expected us to land with about 2 minutes of fuel left, and here we were still 100 feet, 30 meters above the surface at 60 seconds. It was a crucial phase. Then there's another call for 30 seconds, Kranz recalled. And at about that time, you know you really start to suck air, and I'm seriously thinking, now we have this land abort decision that the crew is faced with. Are they going to have sufficient fuel to land on the moon, or are they going to have to abort very close to the lunar surface? When it got down to 30 seconds, we were about 10 feet, 3 meters or less from the surface, Aldrin said. I could sneak a lookout because at that point, I don't think Neil cared what the numbers were. He was looking outside. I could see a shadow of the sun behind us. The descent engine, on the other hand, was kicking up so much dust at this altitude that the shadow and a few boulders sticking up through the haze were all Armstrong could use to measure the remaining distance to the surface. Then a long metal rod that extended from the landing legs touched the lunar plane, signaling their landing. A blue light on the console came on, and suddenly the landing was over. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed."
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Armstrong said in concise tones, but there was still a moment of continued silence in mission control. It took us a couple of seconds to really realize that we had made it. The people in the viewing room start stomping, and I mean just cheering and clapping and stomping their feet, Kranz recalled. "I'm so tied up emotionally at this time that I literally cannot speak, and I've got to get my team back on track." It took a physical act to get him back to reality. He recalled that he wrapped his arm on the console, broke his pencil, and finally got back on track by calling his controllers to attention. Regardless, the moon had more tricks up its sleeves, even though the crew had touched down successfully. Armstrong and Aldrin had saved the lunar module by shutting down the landing systems and performing their post-landing checklist. Everything looked good on the moon, but in mission control it was a different story. The consoles observing the lunar module's descent stage showed a potentially dangerous pressure buildup in a descent engine fuel line. Dick Dunn, Grumman's PR man for Apollo, remembered the critical moment like it was yesterday. The intense cold from the lunar surface was getting into the descent stage after the engine shut down. This cold penetrated a fuel line and as a result caused a blockage. The situation was reported immediately by telemetry to Mission Control in Houston, and that was their cause for alarm. A plug of ice was blocking a fuel line. It might melt, or it might cause a relief disc to blow, which would relieve the pressure. It could also cause a catastrophic explosion, but nobody knew what could happen next. As Kranz was deliberating whether or not to tell the astronauts, there was a quick conference among the Grumman reps and the flight controllers. There was some thought given to aborting the exploration of the moon and to initiate the launch sequence right away. Thankfully, the heat that emitted from the engine melted the ice that had formed and the problem went away. Pressures in the engine went back to normal and controllers breathed a heavy sigh of relief. Armstrong and Aldrin, on the other hand, continued their checklists unaware. 3 hours later, Armstrong and Aldrin were ready to set foot on the moon. But as they prepared to exit the lunar module, yet another issue cropped up. They could not get all the air out of the lunar module. Both astronauts opened the valve and watched as the oxygen vented out. But even as it read 0, they could not get the hatch open. There was still too much pressure inside the lander. "We tried to pull the door open and it wouldn't come open," Aldrin said. "We thought, well, I wonder if we're going to get out or not. It took an abnormal time for it to finally get to a point where we felt we could pull on a fairly flimsy door." In fact, Aldrin finally resorted to peeling back one edge of the front hatch, but carefully. You don't want to rupture that door and leave yourself in a vacuum for the rest of the mission, he recalled with a chuckle. Armstrong maneuvered toward the open hatch assisted by Aldrin. As Armstrong twisted his bulky suit to move out of the lander, something tiny snapped. Armstrong's backpack had broken the ascent engine arming switch. Although they had no idea at the time, this was another dangerous situation waiting ahead. In Buzz Aldrin's book, Magnificent Desolation, The Long Journey Home from the Moon, Aldrin recalls spotting something on the floor of the lunar module that didn't belong there. I looked closer and jolted a bit, he writes. There on the dust on the floor on the right side of the cabin lay a circuit breaker switch that had broken off. Wondering where the switch had come from, he looked at the rows of breakers on the instrument panel. Then he gulped hard. The broken switch had snapped off from the engine arm's circuit breaker, the one vital breaker needed to send electrical power to the ascent engine that would lift Neil and me off the moon, he wrote. Immediately, he was sure that either he or Armstrong must have bumped the switch in the cramped space accidentally with their large backpacks while they tried to get out of the lunar module door. Regardless of how the circuit breaker switch had broken off, the circuit breaker had to be pushed back in again for the ascent engine to ignite to get us back home, he wrote in his book. The broken switch was reported to Mission Control immediately when they noticed, but after an unsettled night trying to get some sleep, Houston had not found a solution the next morning. Time was running out, so Aldrin looked closer at the problem. After examining it more closely, I thought that if I could find something in the lunar module to push into the circuit, it might hold, he wrote. But since it was electrical, I decided not to put my finger in or use anything that had metal on the end. I had a felt-tipped pen in the shoulder pocket of my suit that might do the job. After moving the countdown procedure up by a couple of hours in case it didn't work, I inserted the pen into the small opening where the circuit breaker switch should have been and pushed it in. Sure enough, the circuit breaker held. Assuming the engine arm circuit breaker had stayed open, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would have probably been stuck. Even the NASA chief historian William Barry acknowledged it. Had the felt-tip pen not worked, I'm certain that Mission Control and the crew would have worked hard to find other ways to close the circuit so that the ascent engine could be fired, he says. But this was a severe situation, enough that on other lunar modules that were used after Aldrin and Armstrong's mission, a guard was kept over those circuit breakers to prevent a similar problem. Happy with the improvisational outcome, the astronauts were going to get off the moon after all. And to this day, Buzz Aldrin still has the broken circuit breaker switch and the felt-tipped pen he used to ignite the engines. It must be a delightful artifact, but not as special as the one Neil Armstrong held onto from the 1969 space mission. The first man to walk on the moon kept a bag full of small parts from the Eagle lunar module that he and Apollo 11 crewmate Buzz Aldrin had famously piloted to a landing in front of over 600 million viewers. The stowage bag was found by Armstrong's widow after he died in 2012. I received an email from Carol Armstrong that she had located in one of Neil's closets a white cloth bag filled with assorted small items that looked like they may have come from a spacecraft. Alan Needle, the Apollo curator at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, wrote in a statement, "Needless to say, for a curator of a collection of space artifacts, it is hard to imagine anything more exciting." The bag was referred to as the McDivitt purse after the Apollo 9 astronaut whose idea it was to include aboard the spacecraft. Its contents, identified by Needle and the team behind the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, included Armstrong's waist tether, utility lights and their brackets, equipment netting, and an emergency wrench. It also included the optical sight that was mounted above Armstrong's window and the 16mm data acquisition camera that recorded the iconic footage of the lander's final approach and Armstrong's descent down the ladder to take his small step onto the moon. The 16mm DAC, given the images that it captured, ranks as enormously important. He noted that all of the items have added significance given their connection to Armstrong. What was strange was that Neil Armstrong kept the bag a secret for over 4 decades. Even when he was asked about mementos by his authorized biographer, Armstrong didn't talk about the historic artifacts that were kept in his closet, even though the bag was not something Armstrong sneaked home from the moon. After returning to lunar orbit, the bag and its contents were moved from Eagle to the Columbia Command Module before the lander was directed to crash back to the surface. If the purse had remained aboard, it too would have been destroyed. Armstrong did mention the purse to Command Module pilot Michael Collins as it was being transferred from one craft to the other. That is just a bunch of trash that we want to take back, lunar module parts, odds and ends, Armstrong said. Later, Collins called Mission Control to note where the bag was being placed for the trip home and about how much it weighed. It is not known how the purse came to be in Armstrong's possession after the mission, but it wasn't unusual for the astronauts to retain small spent parts of their capsules as souvenirs. However, it's bewildering to discover these things that happened on NASA's first mission to the moon and how they could have turned things bad. Thankfully, the first man and the mission that took him to the moon ended on a good note. However, why do you think Neil Armstrong hid those space mission artifacts from the entire world, even his wife? In a statement, Neil Armstrong and his team on the moon said they broke a few rules by bouncing off to a part of the moon to take pictures of some interesting bedrocks. What if those pictures of moon rocks turned out to be extraterrestrials? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below.